Mr. Murrow, Governor, Mr. Minnow, I want to express our thanks to the radio stations who were so helpful and contributed such an important national service to us during the difficult days that have just passed. We were extremely anxious to get across our point of view, which was the point of view of the free people of this hemisphere, to the people of Cuba in late October and early November. We therefore asked a number of radio stations if they could assist us. The Voice of America broadcast to Latin America and to Cuba through short wave. We were anxious that medium wave be used, and the only device that we could use was the radio stations. We went to all of them. They immediately volunteered their assistance. None of them put forward all of the objections which they could have in regard to previous programs and previous commitments, but instead immediately made their stations available, and from dusk till dawn they broadcast the message of the United States to the people of Cuba. We're very grateful to them. I think they showed two things. First, how significant radio is in getting across a message beyond national boundaries. And secondly, they showed how patriotic were those men who ran these stations. We're glad to have them here today.
Mr. President, the first certificate goes to KAAY.
I'll read this. For service of special merit, the government of the United States of America commends the dedicated and patriotic service of radio station KAAY for its performance during the Cuban crisis of October-November 1962. This station voluntarily canceled its own programs and instead, from dusk till dawn, during this period, relayed programs of the Voice of America to Cuba. In so doing, it performed a service of great value to the American people and government in a time of great crisis. In recognition thereof, this certificate is rendered by a grateful nation. Signed, Edward Murrow, Newton Minnow, and John Kennedy. Who's KAAY? Thank you, sir. Thank you.
WRUL, Mr. President.
A similar message of appreciation to WRUL, which also voluntarily canceled its own programs and instead, during this period, relayed programs of the Voice of America to Cuba. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
KGEI.
Station KGEI. This station voluntarily canceled its own programs and instead, during this period, relayed programs of the Voice of America to Cuba and performed a service of great value to the American people.
Thank you, Mr. President. WGBS.
This certificate is presented to WGBS, which voluntarily canceled its own programs and from dusk to dawn during this period relayed programs of the Voice of America to Cuba and rendered a great service to our country. Thank you.
WMIE.
Station WMIE, this certificate for service of special merit. The station voluntarily canceled its own programs and from dusk to dawn during this period relayed programs of the Voice of America to Cuba and performed a service of great value to the American people.
Thank you, Mr. President. WCKY.
Station WCKR, during the Cuban crisis of October-November 1962, voluntarily canceled its own programs and from dusk to dawn relayed programs of the Voice of America to Cuba.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I want to present this certificate to WWL, which participated in this program in October and November of relaying the Voice of America to Cuba and rendered great service by so doing. Thank you. WKWF relayed during the Cuban crisis programs of the Voice of America and canceled its own programs, thereby rendering a great service to the American people.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. WSB, station which canceled its own programs and from dusk to dawn during this period relayed programs of the Voice of America to Cuba. I'm very appreciative to them.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Station WCKY canceled its programs during the Cuban crisis and relayed instead from dusk to dawn programs of the Voice of America to the people of Cuba and rendered great service to the country.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you
President.
very much. Thank you.
Everyone, I think, Mr. President.
I want to thank you all very much. Ed, do you want to say something?